My name is Mark, and I always thought of myself as a simple, grounded man dedicated to my family, my work, and the traditions that gave my life meaning. But that all changed one unforgettable weekend. It started innocently enough, a routine hunting trip with someone I barely knew, a favor to my wife. But what unfolded in the woods tested every ounce of my willpower, shattered the boundaries I thought I'd never cross, and forced me to confront desires I never believed I had. I'm sharing this not for judgment, but because this story still haunts me, and it's far from over. Every year, the first weekend of November marks the start of deer hunting season, my favorite tradition. It's more than just a hobby, it's a ritual, a way to escape the daily grind and reconnect with nature. Usually, my wife, Lisa, joins me at our remote hunting cabin, a sanctuary nestled in 20,000 acres of untouched Missouri forest. We've spent over a decade turning that land into our little paradise, carving trails, building food plots, and perfecting the cabin. But this year, things were different. A few weeks ago, over dinner, Lisa announced she wouldn't be joining me this time. She had been selected to attend a prestigious series of educational reform meetings at the state capitol. While I was proud of her accomplishment, the thought of spending my birthday during the hunting opener alone wasn't exactly thrilling. Normally, I wouldn't have minded, but my wife had been adamant, insistent, actually, that I shouldn't go out there alone, not after my heart scare earlier in the year. Her solution? Chloe. Chloe was one of Lisa's colleagues, a young woman I'd met a handful of times at school functions. She was pleasant, bubbly, and far younger than me. Recently divorced, Chloe was navigating life with a kind of optimism that belied the pain I suspected she was carrying. Lisa had arranged for Chloe to join me for her first hunting trip, insisting that it would be good for both of us. I wouldn't be alone, and Chloe would get a chance to learn something new. To say I was skeptical would be an understatement. I'd been looking forward to the solitude, the quiet mornings in the blind, and the evenings by the fire with just my thoughts. Having a tag along, especially one who didn't know a rifle from a fishing rod, wasn't part of the plan. Friday evening rolled around, and I found myself pulling into Chloe's driveway. Lisa had instructed me to honk the horn, something I'd normally consider rude, but I went along with it. The front door opened and Chloe emerged, framed by the light spilling out from the house. She was burdened with enough gear to outfit a small army, her cheerful smile lighting up the evening. "Hi, Mark," she called, her voice bright and full of energy. I got out of the truck to help her load her things. "That's quite the setup," I said, nodding to the impressive pile of bags. She laughed. "Lisa told me to come prepared. I might have overdone it." She talked the entire drive to the cabin, her chatter filling the cab with stories about work. Her divorce and random anecdotes about her life were a stark contrast to the quiet I'd expected, but I couldn't say I minded. Her energy was contagious, and I found myself smiling despite my initial reluctance. We arrived at the cabin around 9 p.m., the moon casting a soft glow over the clearing. I immediately got to work turning on the power and heating up the place while Chloe moved into the loft. By the time the fire crackled in the wood stove, the cabin felt warm and inviting. I settled into the great room, flipping on an old war movie, trying to relax. But just as I was beginning to unwind, Chloe called down from the loft, "Is it okay if I use the shower?" "Sure, go ahead," I replied, barely glancing away from the screen. A few minutes later, I heard the faint creak of the spiral staircase. My attention snapped to Chloe as she walked by, wrapped in nothing but a small towel. It barely covered her, riding up as she moved. My eyes lingered longer than they should have before I forced myself to look away. This was going to be an interesting weekend. As I sat in the great room trying to focus on the war movie playing on the small TV, I couldn't shake the image of Chloe descending the stairs in that tiny towel, the way the dim cabin light caught her damp hair, the way her bare shoulders gleamed. It was an image I had no business holding on to, yet it lingered. I scolded myself, shaking my head to clear my thoughts. Chloe was Lisa's colleague, a friend even, and this trip was about teaching her how to hunt, nothing more. The sound of the shower running reached my ears, along with Chloe's soft humming. It was innocent, cheerful even, but it tugged at something in me that I wasn't proud of. I tried to focus on the movie, leaning forward in my chair as the climactic battle scene unfolded on the screen, but my mind wandered. Chloe was just on the other side of the bathroom door, her voice carrying through the thin walls. My chest tightened and I clenched my fists, willing myself to ignore the thoughts creeping in. After what felt like an eternity, the water stopped. The sound of humming was replaced by the soft rustling of a towel, and the faint creak of the floorboards as Chloe moved about the bathroom. I kept my eyes glued to the TV, forcing myself not to imagine what she looked like on the other side of that door. The movie ended and I grabbed the remote, flipping through the channels in search of a distraction. When Chloe finally emerged, her damp hair wrapped in a second towel, she looked refreshed, her cheeks glowing from the heat of the shower. She smiled at me as she descended the staircase, now dressed in a pair of navy blue shorts and a cropped white top that left little to the imagination. The shirt rode up slightly as she moved, revealing a hint of her toned stomach. "You all set for tomorrow?" I asked, doing my best to sound casual. "Yep," she said cheerfully, holding up an empty jar of peanut butter. "Just need this for later." I raised an eyebrow, confused, but decided not to ask. She popped down on the sofa next to me, setting the jar on the coffee table, the faint scent of her shampoo wafted over, a mix of something floral and sweet. I shifted uncomfortably, suddenly feeling the smallness of the space between us. "Thanks for letting me tag along this weekend," she said, turning to face me. Her eyes sparkled, genuine and warm. "Lisa really talked up this whole hunting experience, so I'm excited to see what it's all about." "Of course," I replied, forcing a smile. "It's a great spot, quiet, lots of wildlife. You'll enjoy it." She leaned back, tucking her legs under her, and the movement drew my eyes to the curve of her thighs. I quickly looked away, cursing myself silently. This was going to be harder than I thought. For the next hour, we chatted about hunting basics. I walked her through the plan for the morning, the gear she'd need, and how to stay patient in the blind. She listened intently, nodding along and asking thoughtful questions. But every so often, her gaze would linger on me, her lips curling into a subtle smile that I couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't flirtatious exactly, but it wasn't just friendly either. As the fire crackled in the wood stove, Chloe stretched her arms, reaching over her head. The movement caused her top to ride up further, revealing the faintest line of her lower back. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my focus on the conversation, but my resolve was wearing thin. Eventually, she stood, picking up the jar and heading toward the loft. "Well, I'm going to call it a night," she said, pausing at the base of the stairs. "Thanks again, Mark. This weekend's already been great. Good night." I managed to watch her ascend the spiral staircase. My gaze followed her until she disappeared into the loft, the sound of her footsteps fading. Alone again, I leaned back on the couch and let out a long breath, the tension in my chest refusing to ease. I had a sinking feeling that this weekend was about to become far more complicated than I had anticipated. I woke up the next morning to the sound of my alarm buzzing relentlessly. It was still dark outside, and the cabin felt colder than I had expected. I climbed out of bed, shivering slightly as my feet hit the hardwood floor. My mind was still clouded from a restless sleep. Images of Chloe descending the stairs last night, her carefree demeanor, her bright smile, they'd all lingered longer than they should have. Shaking my head, I told myself to focus. Today was about hunting, nothing more. I dressed quickly in lightweight thermal gear, followed by my usual camouflage hunting attire. By the time I stepped out of my room, the faint smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen greeted me. Chloe was already awake, or so I thought. I called up to the loft to make sure. "Chloe, time to get moving," I said, my voice cutting through the morning stillness. Her groggy response came moments later. "Okay, give me a minute." I busied myself with preparing breakfast, bacon and eggs sizzling in the pan. I wasn't much of a cook, but I'd perfected a few simple meals over the years. As the smell of food filled the cabin, I heard her footsteps on the spiral staircase. When I turned to greet her, my breath caught in my throat. Chloe was descending the stairs completely unclothed, her steps slow and casual as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Her damp hair framed her face, and her skin glowed in the soft light filtering through the cabin's windows. I quickly looked away, my face flushing. "Good morning," she said, her voice light and carefree as if nothing was out of the ordinary. "Morning," I muttered, focusing intently on the bacon. "You, might want to put something on. It's cold outside." She laughed softly, the sound teasing in its tone. "Oh come on, Mark, don't act so shy. It's just skin." I clenched the spatula in my hand, unsure how to respond. My pulse quickened as she walked past me to grab a jar of peanut butter from the fridge. She leaned slightly over the counter, her back to me, completely unbothered by her state of undress. I tried to keep my eyes on the stove, but the temptation to glance over was maddening. "Seriously though," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "we're heading out soon. You'll freeze out there." She turned, finally making her way back upstairs. Fine, I'll get dressed," she said, tossing me a grin over her shoulder. "Don't worry, I'll be ready." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, shaking my head as I focused on plating the food. By the time she came back down, she was fully dressed in her hunting gear, looking as though the earlier scene hadn't even happened. She grabbed her plate and joined me at the table, chatting excitedly about the day ahead. But the tension between us was palpable, at least to me. Every laugh, every smile she gave me seemed to carry an undercurrent of something unspoken. I couldn't decide if she was testing me or if this was just who she was, carefree and uninhibited. Either way, it was becoming harder to ignore. After breakfast, we loaded up the ATV with our gear. Chloe climbed onto the seat behind me, her arms wrapping around my waist as I started the engine. The chill of the morning air bit at my face, but her warmth pressed against my back was impossible to miss. She clung tightly as we sped through the woods, the ATV cutting through the darkness. When we reached the hunting spot, I helped her off the ATV and handed her the rifle. "From here we walk," I said, my voice lower than usual. She nodded, her excitement evident. "Lead the way." As we tread through the woods toward the blind, the silence of the forest seemed to mirror the silence between us. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was treading dangerously close to a line I had no business crossing. But the way Chloe glanced at me when she thought I wasn't looking, the slight curve of her lips when she smiled, it was as if she knew exactly what she was doing. And somehow, I knew this hunting trip was about more than just deer. The forest was still, the kind of quiet that only the early morning hours could bring. She followed close behind me as we made our way to the hunting blind. Her boots crunched softly on the fallen leaves, the sound barely breaking the silence. I glanced back at her a few times, ensuring she could keep up, but she seemed more than capable, her determination etched clearly on her face. I couldn't help but admire how quickly she adapted, though I tried to keep my thoughts from wandering. When we reached the blind, I stopped and turned to her. "This is it," I said, gesturing to the small structure nestled between the trees. "It's nothing fancy, but it does the job." Chloe nodded, her eyes wide with excitement. "It's perfect." I climbed the short ladder and stepped inside, holding the door open for her. She followed, her presence filling the small space as she took a seat on the bench beside me. The blind was cozy, just enough room for two, with a few small windows that overlooked the clearing ahead. The sun was beginning to rise, casting faint golden light over the trees. It was a sight I had seen countless times, but this morning it felt different. I handed Chloe her rifle, keeping my voice low. "Remember, safety first. Keep the barrel pointed away, and don't load it until you're ready to shoot." She nodded, her expression serious. "Got it." I leaned back against the wall, watching as she adjusted her position, her movements deliberate and focused. For a while we sat in silence, our breaths the only sound in the small space. The air between us felt heavy, not just from the anticipation of the hunt, but from something else. I tried to focus on the clearing ahead, scanning for any sign of movement, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Chloe. She shifted beside me, her knee brushing against mine. I glanced at her, but she seemed intent on watching the field. I told myself it was nothing, a simple accident, but the small touch sent a jolt through me. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay focused. After a while, Chloe broke the silence. "It's so peaceful out here," she whispered, her voice soft. I nodded. "That's one of the reasons I love it. Just you, the forest, and the quiet." She smiled, her eyes meeting mine for a moment before she looked away. "Thank you for bringing me. I know it wasn't your first choice, but it means a lot." I hesitated, unsure how to respond. "It's not a problem," I said finally. "Everyone deserves to experience this at least once." The minutes stretched on, the tension in the air growing thicker with every passing moment. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the task at hand. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement. I nudged Chloe gently, pointing toward the clearing. "There," I whispered, "by the edge of the trees." She raised her rifle, following my direction. A young buck had stepped into the clearing, its antlers small but visible. It moved cautiously, its head bobbing as it sniffed the air. "Wait for it to turn broadside," I instructed, my voice barely audible. "You want a clean shot right behind the shoulder." She nodded, her hands steady as she lined up the shot. Everything seemed to hold still. The forest, the deer, even my breath. Then the rifle clicked. My stomach sank as I realized what had happened, no round chambered. I asked quietly, "Chloe?" She frowned, working the lever to load the gun, but it was too late. The buck had bolted, disappearing into the thicket. She let out a frustrated sigh, lowering the rifle. "I thought it was ready," she said, her voice tinged with disappointment. "It's okay," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "It happens. You'll get another chance." She leaned back, her head resting against the wall. "I feel so stupid." "You're not," I replied. "Hunting takes practice. You'll get the hang of it." The mood in the blind shifted after that, the initial excitement giving way to a quiet frustration. Chloe pulled off her jacket, muttering something about it being too warm. I tried to focus on the clearing, but my thoughts kept circling back to her, the way she moved, the way she spoke. It was all becoming harder to ignore. And then, as she sat there beside me, peeling off her thermal layers one by one, I realized the morning wasn't just heating up outside, it was heating up in here too. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep my focus. The air inside the blind was warm, almost stifling, as the morning sun climbed higher. Chloe had shed her jacket, and was now sitting beside me in just her undershirt and camouflage pants. I tried to focus on the clearing, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement, but the tension in the small space was becoming impossible to ignore. My heart pounded in my chest, though I couldn't say if it was from the anticipation of spotting a deer, or the way Chloe shifted beside me, her movements drawing my attention. "Do you always sit out here for hours like this?" she asked, breaking the silence. "Pretty much," I replied, keeping my eyes forward. "Patience is a big part of hunting." She sighed, leaning back against the wall. "I guess I'm not very patient." I chuckled softly. "It's something you learn over time. Being out here teaches you how to slow down, how to be still." She glanced at me, a faint smile on her lips. "You seem good at that." "Being still, I mean. It's calming." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I nodded, trying to dismiss the strange warmth her words stirred in me. She shifted again, this time pulling off her thermal top, leaving her in a snug-fitting tank that clung to her in a way I couldn't ignore. My throat felt dry, and I told myself to look away, but it was like trying to ignore the sun. "Much better," she said, exhaling as she leaned forward to stretch. "It's so stuffy in here." "Yeah, well, it'll cool down when the sun dips," I muttered, struggling to keep my focus on anything but her. The silence stretched, the air growing heavier with each passing second. Chloe seemed oblivious, or maybe not. She leaned back, letting her head rest against the wall as she closed her eyes. The curve of her neck, the way her chest rose and fell with each breath, it was maddening. I clenched my jaw, gripping my rifle tighter as if that could steady me. "Do you ever get lonely out here?" she asked suddenly, her voice soft. I blinked, caught off guard. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but it's part of the experience. Being alone helps clear your head." She opened her eyes and turned to me, her gaze steady. "I think I'd go crazy being alone like this." "It's not for everyone," I said with a shrug. She was quiet for a moment, her eyes lingering on me in a way that made my pulse quicken. Then she smiled, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "Well, at least you've got me for company this time." I let out a nervous laugh, unsure of where this was going. "Yeah, I guess I do." Her smile widened, and she leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "You don't mind, do you?" My throat tightened, and I shook my head. "No, of course not." The space between us felt smaller than ever, the tension almost unbearable. She reached out, her fingers brushing against my arm. It was a light touch, but it sent a jolt through me. I turned to her, ready to say something, anything, to break the moment, but the words caught in my throat. "Thanks for bringing me out here," she said, her voice soft. "I know it's not the same without your wife, but I'm glad to be here with you." I swallowed hard, nodding. "It's no problem. I'm glad you're here too." The words felt heavier than they should have, laden with meaning I couldn't quite unpack. Chloe smiled again, her gaze lingering on mine before she turned back to the clearing. I tried to follow her lead, forcing my attention outward, but the line between us had already begun to blur. The boundary that I'd sworn to maintain was slipping, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to stop it. The sun was dipping lower, casting golden hues across the treetops, but I could barely focus on the beauty of the forest. Chloe's presence beside me had become almost magnetic, her every movement commanding my attention no matter how hard I tried to resist. We sat in silence, waiting for another chance at spotting a deer, but the real tension wasn't out in the woods, it was in the blind. She shifted beside me, her bare arm brushing against mine. The contact was brief, almost innocent, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. I tightened my grip on the rifle, willing myself to concentrate on the task at hand. "I'm sorry about missing that shot earlier," she said softly, breaking the silence. "It happens," I replied, my voice more gruff than I intended. "Everyone misses sometimes." She turned toward me, her expression earnest. "Do you think I'll get another chance?" I glanced at her, meeting her gaze for a moment too long. "Maybe. Deer are unpredictable, but you have to be ready." She nodded, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Thanks for being patient with me. I didn't think this trip would be so intense." The way she said intense made my heart skip a beat. I looked away, pretending to scan the clearing. "It's all part of the experience." Silence fell again, but it wasn't the peaceful kind, it was charged, the air between us thick with unspoken words. Chloe shifted again, this time leaning in. Moving forward to adjust her hair fell over her shoulder, brushing against my arm as she moved. I could feel the heat of her skin, the faint scent of her shampoo lingering in the air. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, but then she turned to me, her eyes searching mine. "You've been quiet," she said, her voice low. "What's on your mind?" I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "Just keeping an eye out for deer." Her smile widened, but there was something knowing in her gaze. "You're a terrible liar, you know that." I chuckled nervously, shaking my head. "I'm not lying." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "You're distracted. I can feel it." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Chloe," she placed a hand on my arm, her touch light but deliberate. "You don't have to say anything," she murmured. I feel it too." My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't happening, it couldn't be. But the look in her eyes, the warmth of her touch, it was impossible to deny. The boundary I'd been so determined to maintain was crumbling, and a part of me didn't want to stop it. I looked away, trying to gather my thoughts. "This isn't right," I said, my voice barely audible. "Maybe," she replied, her tone soft, "but it doesn't feel wrong." Her words hung in the air, challenging everything I thought I knew about myself. I wanted to argue, to push her away, but the truth was I didn't want to. For the first time in years, I felt something stir inside me, something I hadn't even realized was missing. "Chloe," I began, but she silenced me with a gentle touch to my cheek. "It's okay," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything." And in that moment, as the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, I made a choice. It wasn't a conscious decision, but rather an instinctive surrender to the pull between us. I leaned in, closing the distance, and for the first time, I let the boundaries fall away completely. The moment her lips met mine, the world outside the blind ceased to exist. The cold, the quiet woods, even the promise of deer, all of it faded into the background. Her kiss was hesitant at first, testing, like she was waiting for me to stop her. But I couldn't. Instead, I found myself leaning into it, my hands instinctively moving to her arms, then her back, pulling her closer. For a split second, guilt surged through me like a flash flood. My wife's face flickered in my mind, her trust, her unwavering belief in me. But then Chloe sighed softly against my lips, her fingers grazing the back of my neck, and all rational thought dissolved into the warmth of the moment. "This is wrong," I whispered, breaking the kiss but keeping her close. My forehead rested against hers, and I could feel her breath against my skin. "Maybe," she replied, her voice barely audible, "but does it feel wrong?" I didn't answer. How could I? She was right, it didn't feel wrong. It felt exhilarating, like a door I never knew existed had been thrown open, flooding me with sensations I hadn't felt in years. Part of me wanted to slam that door shut to run back to the safety of my carefully built life, but another part of me, the part that hadn't felt alive in far too long, wanted to see what lay on the other side. She pulled back slightly, her gaze searching mine. "If you want me to stop, tell me now," she said, her tone serious. "But if you don't?" She trailed off, leaving the choice in my hands. I stared at her, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure she could hear it. Her eyes held no malice, no manipulation, just an unspoken vulnerability that mirrored my own. It was a moment suspended in time, and I knew that whatever I chose, there would be no going back. "I don't want you to stop," I heard myself say, my voice barely more than a whisper. Her lips curved into a soft smile, and she leaned in again, her hands sliding up to cradle my face. This time, the kiss wasn't hesitant, it was deep, deliberate, and filled with a passion that ignited something in me I thought had been long extinguished. My hands found her waist, pulling her closer until there was no space left between us. We sat like that for what felt like hours, the outside world a distant memory. Every touch, every whispered word, every stolen glance felt electric, charged with the knowledge that we were crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. But in that moment, I didn't care. For the first time in years, I felt seen, wanted, alive. Eventually, the cold began to seep into the blind, and she shivered against me. I pulled away reluctantly, my hands still resting on her hips. "We should head back," I said, my voice rough with emotion. She nodded, but she didn't move right away. Instead, she rested her head against my shoulder, her arms wrapping around me in a way that felt both comforting and possessive. "I don't want this to end," she murmured. "It doesn't have to," I replied, the words slipping out before I could stop them. The weight of their meaning settled over me, but I didn't regret them, not yet. We dressed in silence, the tension between us now a tangible thing. As we made our way back to the cabin, I couldn't help but steal glances at her, the way her hair caught the fading sunlight, the curve of her smile when she caught me looking. The guilt was there, lurking in the back of my mind, but it wasn't enough to overshadow the warmth that had taken root in my chest. Back at the cabin, as the fire crackled and the shadows danced on the walls, she sat across from me, her gaze steady and unreadable. "This changes everything, doesn't it?" she asked softly. I nodded, unable to look away. "Yes, it does." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken fears and unacknowledged truths. But there was also something else, something unspoken but undeniable, a connection, a spark, a beginning. And in that moment, I knew there was no turning back. The cabin was silent, save for the occasional crackle of the fire. Chloe sat across from me, her hands cupped around a mug of tea, her eyes focused on the flames. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept stealing glances at me when she thought I wasn't looking. The weight of what we had done lingered between us, thick and suffocating. I couldn't stop replaying the events of the morning, the heat of her touch, the way her lips had lingered on mine, the sheer electricity of it all. But now, as the reality of our choices began to sink in, the thrill was replaced by something heavier, guilt, fear, doubt. "We need to talk," I finally said, breaking the silence. She looked up at me, her expression unreadable. "I know," she replied softly, setting her mug down on the table. "But I don't even know where to start." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees and running a hand through my hair. "What happened out there? It can't happen again." Her lips tightened, and for a moment, I thought she might argue, but then she nodded, her gaze dropping to her hands. "I know," she said quietly. "I knew it was wrong even while it was happening." But she trailed off, her voice catching. "But what?" I pressed gently, needing to hear her say it. She hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. "But it felt real," she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It felt like something I've been missing for so long, and I didn't want to let it go." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut because I understood exactly what she meant. For years, I had buried myself in routines, responsibilities, and obligations, ignoring the growing void inside me. And in those stolen moments with Chloe, that void had been filled, temporarily, perhaps, but filled nonetheless. "It felt real to me too," I admitted, my voice low. "But that doesn't make it right. We've both crossed a line, Chloe, a line we can't uncross." She looked up at me then, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Do you regret it?" she asked, her voice trembling. I hesitated, the question cutting deeper than I expected. Did I regret it? Yes, I regretted the betrayal, the dishonesty, the pain this would undoubtedly cause if it ever came to light. But the moment itself, the connection I had felt with her, that was harder to answer. "I regret the circumstances," I said carefully. "I regret what this means for my marriage, for your relationship with my wife. But I can't sit here and tell you that I regret feeling alive for the first time in years." Her tears spilled over and she quickly wiped them away, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you," she said. "I thought this trip would just be about hunting, about learning something new. I didn't expect." She stopped herself, shaking her head. "Neither did I," said, my voice heavy. "But now we're here, and we have to figure out how to move forward. Because if this gets out..." I trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The thought of my wife finding out, of the fallout that would follow, was too much to bear. Chloe nodded, her expression somber. "I'll keep it to myself," she promised. "No one has to know." "And it stays that way," I said firmly. "No slip-ups, no second chances. This ends here." She swallowed hard, nodding again. I understand. For a while neither of us spoke. The fire crackled, the logs shifting slightly as the flames consumed them. I stared into the embers, wondering how something that had burned so brightly could fade so quickly, leaving only ash in its wake. Eventually, Chloe stood, wrapping her arms around herself as she turned toward the stairs. "I think I'll head to bed," she said softly, not meeting my gaze. I nodded, watching as she ascended the spiral staircase. Her footsteps were light but deliberate. When she disappeared into the loft, I let out a long, shaky breath, my head falling into my hands. The weight of the day pressed down on me, suffocating and unrelenting. I knew I couldn't change what had happened, but I also knew I couldn't let it define me, my marriage, my family, my integrity. They were all on the line now. No matter how tempting it was to dwell on what might have been, I couldn't afford to let this mistake ruin everything I had built. As I stared into the dying flames, I made a silent vow to myself, this would be the last time. The last time I let my desires override my judgment. The last time I put everything I cared about at risk. But even as I made that promise, a small treacherous part of me wondered if I truly had the strength to keep it. Looking back at everything, one thing became painfully clear to me: our actions, no matter how fleeting or driven by emotion, always carry consequences. In life, boundaries matter. Temptation can feel overwhelming, but it's essential to think beyond the moment and consider the damage it may cause to those we care about. Trust and loyalty are fragile, and once broken, they can rarely be repaired. If there's emptiness or unmet needs in a relationship, the right step is to address them openly, not seek fleeting solutions elsewhere. The cost of dishonesty is too great, and the peace of a clear conscience is priceless.